This week, the markets take a dip as Trump's tariffs kick in and a potential government shutdown looms. Our panel weighs in. Is this really it for the Department of Education? And a radical Columbia University student deported for his on-campus protests. Some say it's a violation of his First Amendment rights. We'll get into the debate. These stories and much more straight ahead on The Lion Week in Review. Welcome into this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall, and now let's meet our panel. Some of the men and women behind the stories at ReadLion.com. Josh Mann, our managing editor, Michael Ryan, executive editor, and Valerie Cabana, media contributor here at The Lion. Panel, welcome in. This week I start with something that has piqued my personal interest, and that is the brand new Gavin Newsom podcast. This is something I've been discussing privately, personally, off the show here, and I just thought I'd bring the panel in to discuss it too. Newsom launches this new podcast, and each week so far he has brought in a prominent conservative to discuss issues with him. Charlie Kirk was first, Michael Savage most recently, and I guess next week Steve Bannon. And I guess I wanted to start by asking the panel, is this good politics by Gavin Newsom? And as far as the conservatives go, is this good for their brand versus is this good for the conservative cause? Michael, I'll start with you.
Well, it's great for Gavin, terrible for politics because basically these conservatives, and I love these guys, but they're giving him more unwarranted credibility than he ever deserves. He's basically trying to remake his far-left image. They're helping. He's basically filming a campaign commercial for when he runs for president. My question is, okay, if you're all of a sudden adopting all these, center-right policies, why don't you implement them?
Josh Mann.
Yeah, that's right. The proof is in the pudding. I think it's obvious. It's fairly obvious he wants to become president. I think he sees what Obama did and the success that Obama had, and I think he wants to kind of remake himself as this kind of articulate, hopeful person. And you're right. The conservatives are kind of playing into his hand, and I think they probably just need to stop.
And Valerie, I will use this question. I'd love for you to answer it, but then pivot right into one of the stories that are related to San Francisco. In fact, Michael Savage was talking to Gavin Newsom, arguing with him about San Francisco policies and politics. So I know there's a story at the line you wanted to discuss, but I'd ask you first about the Newsom show.
Absolutely. So I agree completely with Michael and Josh on everything that they've said. I think this is just something that Democrats and Republicans need to never forget. I mean, majority of Democrats across the country didn't like Gavin Newsom. And so he's trying to make himself this image to run for president. And it's not something that is really changing about him. He's just trying to create a new perception. So we really need to be on the lookout for that. So in San Francisco, I would direct you to The Lion on social media or readline.com. You'll find an image of a biological male holding a sign that says trans women are biological women. Now, maybe you can help me make sense of this. I can't make any sense of it. Trans activists are protesting a spa who has decided to hold women and men only nights once a month. That is once a month that women can go to the spa and not have to worry if they're going to see a man posing as a woman. I can tell you one thing, and that's that nudity tells all. So if you are a man posing as a woman and you go to a spa and you undress, everyone's going to know that you're a man. Why can't biological women have one night a month? It's not like they're discriminating against you, but they are really spewing this, turning it into discrimination suit. But no, trans women are not biological women, and that is insulting to women worldwide.
Yeah, and these are the kind of policies, to the point of the Gavin Newsom discussion that I'm sure he fully embraces. Michael, we turn to you, a really fascinating story about a win, a victory at the state level over, of all things, China.
Yeah, in 2020, the state of Missouri filed a lawsuit against China on two claims. One, having created and leaked the virus, and two, on having hoarded the personal protection equipment, PPE, after the virus was spread. Now, that lawsuit was initially dismissed in 2022 by a federal judge in Missouri for lack of jurisdiction. An appeals court, though, reinstated the hoarding claim. China never did acknowledge this lawsuit, never showed up for anything, never filed a brief. So in January, they had a trial on this worldwide pandemic that killed millions that lasted about an hour. And then on March 7th, the judge awarded Missouri $24 billion in damages from China. Now, the Missouri Attorney General, Andrew Bailey, says he's going to look at seizing assets from China, farmland and other assets in Missouri and perhaps outside the state to satisfy that judgment. Now, even though China never defended itself, we have the AP for that, the Associated Press for that. And the Associated Press just wrote, good luck recovering that judgment. But regardless of whether it's ever recovered, it's a moral victory.
You know, it is sort of an interesting thing, and I hadn't thought about it until Michael just said it, Josh. We know that there are hundreds, thousands of acres of farmland owned at least by Chinese interests, if not directly by the Chinese government. Could that be a way for restitution to be paid?
Yeah, A.G. Bailey thinks so, and it's been a security concern for a lot of states, especially red states have seemed to be on the forefront of this. Worry about foreign governments or foreign nationals who are buying up farmland, especially around security bases. And so there's huge security concerns around this. And it seems like you're kind of killing two birds with one stone if you just seize those assets.
Let me pivot to self-deporting. This is a really interesting story that you have going on at readlion.com, and maybe you heard about it this week. If you didn't, let's dive into it a little bit. Josh, could you give us some of the details on what this is? It's an app that the Biden administration originally created, and now the Trump administration has taken over and made it do something entirely different.
That's right. And so under the Biden administration, there was an app that basically eased your entry into the United States. The Biden administration has been widely criticized for how easily people could be paroled into the United States, claim to seek asylum and other things. And some of these people had criminal records. They weren't vetted. Well, Kristi Noem has announced that now the app actually has an option for self-deportation, which seemed actually really clever. But here's the incentive, is if you're here in the country illegally, if you will self-deport, you actually could re-enter legally in the future. But if you don't, and you are deported because you're here illegally because you've broken a law, then you will not have that opportunity. And so there's an incentive built in, and I think it's a wise way to help give people a chance. And, you know, if the left is concerned about compassion on this issue, this actually, to me, seems very logical, rational, and pretty compassionate.
That's an interesting point, Valerie. I mean, if you're not one that likes ICE knocking on the doors of restaurants or other places where you might find illegal aliens, this is an opportunity for them to voluntarily go.
Absolutely. And Josh hit the nail on the head with everything that he said. I love this idea. It does give them the opportunity to do the right thing. And like he said, it is compassionate. And as Christians, we have compassion for these people. We just want them to follow the law. And so the Trump administration has made it clear that anyone who has committed a crime here, they're out. There's no hope for them because they came here illegally. They committed horrendous crimes. They're gone. But this app gives hope to people who do want to enter America legally. So I only wish that this would have come sooner, months ago, so that we could have gotten on this track. But I'm so happy that it's here now, and I'm excited for the hope that it gives these people.
Michael, how about the progress we're making at the border overall? There's been a lot of good news on that front.
There has been. And this phone app that the Biden administration used allowed almost 1 million people to come into the country on a schedule. If you want to try to understand this phone app, it was CBP1. It's kind of like call-ahead seating at your favorite restaurant. They could call ahead and say, "Hey, I'm illegally entering your country." And if it's something, this phone app is something. If the cartels had done it, it would have been a crime. But the Biden administration did it, and the Trump administration, I think it's a brilliant move, repurposed it to self-deporting. In other words, they could send a message out to these people through this app saying, hey, you really ought to self-deport and you get a chance to get back in line. Just a brilliant move.
A remarkable development from Senate Democrats this week on the issue of transgender players in women's sports. That is, biological males pretending to be women in competitive women's sports. Democrats say they're taking a pass, and it's the most interesting argument, Valerie, they're making.
No Senate Democrat voted for this act to protect women's in collegiate sports. How hypocritical is that? They want it on a local level. But what is something that we all talk about wanting on a local level that Democrats say absolutely not to? It's education. We want to see education on a local level, give it back to the states and allow them to pour into the kids on a local level, but you don't want that in colleges to protect women in sports? I mean, that is so hypocritical and, honestly, horrendous.
You know, it's interesting, Josh, that gay marriage, I remember once upon a time, I heard from even some conservatives who said, you can't let states decide. You can't have a state-by-state hodgepodge of rules on whether gay people can get married in one state or another. The feds have got to get involved. Well, if that's your logic, it would certainly stand to reason you've got to have a one standard on biological men playing against women, Josh.
Yeah, it's a total punt. They're punting on it. They're afraid. They ran on this issue unsuccessfully last year. And so I think they're punting and trying to figure out what actually they really want to say they believe about it. And just think about how I just said that. They're trying to figure out what to say they believe. It's pure political posturing. This is the same party that says it's all about civil rights, and yet all of a sudden on an issue that they've talked about in terms of civil rights, they're actually saying, we'll let locals decide. What about Title IX? What do they really think about Title IX? I think it's deeply hypocritical, and they haven't thought very deeply at all about it.
Michael, what is this mind virus, this commitment? If Democrats had taken this vote and gotten it off the table, they could move on and get away from the subject. But rather than do so, they've hitched their wagon to it for such a scant number of people in the population.
Absolutely. And think about this. When the Biden administration was in power, they tried to force schools and colleges to allow transgender on women and girls teams. They tried to force it on there. And now the Democrats are saying, oh, well, let's leave it up to the states. That's kind of a turnaround, isn't it?
Great stuff, panel. Thank you. When we return to the Lion Week in Review, we wade through some of the sound on cable and news from Capitol Hill. That's next when the Lion Week in Review rolls on. Welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. I'm Chris Stigall. If you missed any of today's show or you're interested in more of the great news and information you're hearing today, be sure to regularly check out The Lion at readlion.com. Panel, let's dive into some of the news and sights and sounds of the week with Donald Trump defending his decision to dive headlong into tariffs. Of course, the market got wobbly this week, and here's some reaction.
Well, I think the tariffs are going to be the greatest thing we've ever done as a country. It's going to make our country rich again. We have many companies, as you know, auto companies are opening up plants now. We've had 4 or 5 announced already, but many more are coming. And we're basically going to take back the money, a lot of the money that we've given away over many decades. We've lost our jobs. We've lost our factories. We've lost 90,000 factories since the beginning of NAFTA. It's not that long ago. 90,000 factories. Think of that. And we're going to get them back.
That really is a stunning stat, Josh Mann. 90,000 factories since NAFTA. But the thing is, you can't get 90,000 factory jobs back on a dime. This is going to take a minute or two.
It's going to take a minute. It's going to be painful. And I think what our audience needs to consider is that what we are seeing in the news with the markets is expected. These are expected results of any tariffs and any kind of trade war, which is still in its beginning phases. And just this morning, Canada's announcing over $20 billion worth of new tariffs. And that's kind of gone back and forth a couple of times. The EU just announced some tariffs. These are things that are expected. But if you know anything about President Trump, he's not somebody you want to play chicken with. And I think he will white knuckle the steering wheel, and he will not deviate from this course. And so I think we're just going to have to see how long some of these countries go before they start to capitulate, which is what I expect to happen. And I wouldn't think that there will be any sort of softening from the Trump administration.
It's really just undeniable, Michael. And I understand the conservative free market idea about tariffs, and I understand they're not traditionally popular, but Trump making that argument, when you think about 90,000 factories gone, jobs gone over the years since NAFTA, we have small cities and towns all over the country that have been hollowed out. There are no jobs unless they're government jobs. That is an unsustainable model for this country, is it not, Michael?
Absolutely it is. And what Trump is doing with tariffs is a calculated risk, but it's a worthy one, I think, because we've been bleeding for decades, and we can't continue to bleed this way. We sell $1 trillion less than we buy a year from other countries. So, I mean, that's not sustainable. And at the same time, our federal government is $2 trillion in the red every year. So something's got to happen.
We turn to the potential government shutdown. As we record today's show, the House has passed the CR, the continuing resolution, to keep the government open. Friday is the deadline for the government shutdown. Again, as we talk about this, we're not entirely sure the way the Senate's going to go, but we know they're going to need at least 6 to 7 Democrats to help get this thing passed out of the Senate and keep the government open. Claire McCaskill, a once prominent Democrat from Missouri who's now out of a job and on MSNBC courtesy of Josh Hawley. Claire McCaskill had this to say, interestingly, about Democrats not passing this thing. In other words, shutting the government down this weekend. Take a listen.
The messaging here is a little muddled for the Democrats because it's very important that Democrats don't stand in the way of cutting wasteful spending. But the way these guys are doing it, they're not cutting fat. They're basically breaking bones of government service to America. And it is so haphazard. It is so without merit. It is so unfair. And people are going to start feeling it. That's a separate issue than whether or not they're going to pass this continuing resolution that basically pushes the ball down the field, doesn't do anything really except extend current funding. And here's the other problem the Democrats have. If they end up being the reason that the government shuts down, that muddles their message that, in fact, it's the Trump administration that is trying to shut down your government services like Social Security, like Medicaid, like veterans benefit.
Josh, man, an interesting juxtaposition. They want to blame the cuts and the reduction in spending on the Republicans, but in order to do that, they can't be responsible for shutting down the government, is what she just said.
That's right. You heard her twice, once near the beginning of that clip and near the end, talk about message and messaging. That is what it is about for Claire McCaskill. She doesn't really care about the reality of the policies or funding the government or cutting the bureaucracy. She just doesn't want to look bad as a party. It's strategic for her, which is understandable. This is how politics works. But at the end of the day, they shouldn't stand in the way of cuts to the bureaucracy because it's polling so well among Americans. Appearances aside, I hope that Democrats will do the right thing and start to, act with some conviction and hear their constituents to actually start to do things that are in the best interest of those people that they supposedly represent.
What about this shutdown business in this talk, Michael? Where's it go?
Oh, I think Claire's right that they can't afford to be seen as the people shutting down the government. The Republicans have long been in that position. But I'll go with Josh on this messaging thing. Democrats seem to think their only problem is messaging, that we're just not smart enough to get what they're trying to sell. The messaging is not their problem. It's wrong-headed, unpopular policies. They're against, cutting bloat in government. They're against protecting women and girls in sports and from illegal immigrants. They're against just about everything Americans voted for in November.
It's really interesting you bring that up, actually, because Van Jones in our next clip panel, and Valerie, I'll ask you to respond to this. Here's Van Jones on CNN making the very point that Michael was just making, actually, about his party.
Democrats don't know what to do. This is a nightmare. Somebody like Donald Trump, we thought we'd at least have, Hakeem Jeffries in the speaker's chair to hold him back if we didn't have Kamala in there to do the right thing. Listen, the Democratic Party is going through a massive set of internal crises. You have a party that got trapped two ways. One, defending a broken status quo that nobody likes because they thought that Donald Trump was going to make it worse. But when you're defending the status quo, you're going to lose. And then offending most people in the country, calling everybody sexist and racist and transphobic and every other name, and then saying, please follow us. That's not a good strategy, folks. Defending a broken status quo and offending most of the country turns out is not as popular as my party thought it was going to be.
Valerie, your reaction?
I find it hilarious. They picture themselves as the party of compassion, the party of love. But like he said, you're offending most of the population. The people that voted for Donald Trump, they were voting because they don't like the Democrat radical policies. He didn't just win the popular vote by the Republican Party only. Democrats were voting for him. If you rewinded that clip a little bit further, you would see when he was asked to talk about the Democrat Party, he was like, oh no, actually, can I talk about something else? I don't want to talk about my own party, because it's embarrassing where they're at. And if they keep trying to push radical ideology, Democrats will never win an election again.
Linda McMahon, chosen by President Trump to head the Department of Education, and she said it's her job to put herself out of a job. This week, the big news that as of Tuesday night, 6 o'clock, Department of Ed employees could grab the things, grab their laptops if necessary, and get out, because as of Wednesday morning, the buildings would be shut down and padlocked. Half the Department of Education staff cut instantly, some 2,000-plus jobs. Here's Linda McMahon.
The recent scores that we have seen with our students, when high school students graduating, only 30% of them can read with proficiency. That means 70% can't. When we look at eighth graders who are not proficient in math or reading, we have to do something about this in our country. And we are spending more per pupil than any other country, and we have the lowest results for that. We're doing something wrong. And clearly we want to take the bureaucracy out of the Department of Education and make sure that our states are prepared to have the tools that they need and best practices to really teach their students. Let's let teachers teach. You know, I think teaching is one of the most noble professions that there is, and I think our teachers need to be paid and supported, protected, and allowed to teach in schools and not be bogged down by red tape.
Josh, I don't know if President Trump can eliminate the Department of Education, but he's certainly taken a hatchet to it.
Yeah, and his secretary said some things there that I think almost all teachers would agree with. I mean, what she said there at the end, teaching is a noble profession, and perhaps the most noble. And so you have teachers, you have your Secretary of Education defending your profession, saying we need to cut federal bureaucracy, we need to return control to local jurisdictions. Most teachers I know, even in public schools, want that. And so there's very little, I mean, we have to set politics aside and start looking at policies because the disagreement, a lot of the disagreements are really just media narratives. I think a lot of Americans actually, when you look at the policies, can agree with what's being said.
Really interesting story I want to turn to. This panel I know is going to want to weigh in on the story of Mahmoud Khalil this week, the Columbia University activist here on a green card from Syria, arrested by federal immigration authorities, State Department working to revoke his student visa over bigoted and threatening language against Israel, Jews, and the West. Speaker Mike Johnson was asked about this week. Take a listen.
This guy apparently was a mastermind of those very things, when the gnashing of teeth and the ripping of clothes and the people screaming at me, wanting to rip me limb from limb because I was there talking about moral clarity and how there's a right and a wrong. They were doing that. They disrupted the campus. They were threatening physical violence to their fellow students. If you're on a student visa, I'm going to say this clearly. If you are on a student visa and you're in America and you're an aspiring young terrorist who wants to prey upon your Jewish classmates, you're going home. We're going to arrest your tail and we're going to send you home where you belong. And this is just getting started. So, look, I appreciate free speech. I used to defend it in courts, but this is far beyond the pale of that. When you are threatening your classmates and spewing anti-Semitism and all this hatred, it's enough. And I think the American people understand that. They're supporting it. And I'm glad we have a president who's strong enough to lay down the law.
Michael, that's about as close to salty as you're going to get out of Speaker Mike Johnson. And I know you care deeply about the free speech issue. We all do. But I've heard even some conservatives suggest that this is not in keeping with free speech. Where do you come down on this?
Well, it goes when you're inciting violence, that's not free speech, and you're inciting anti-Semitism. That's not free speech. And the speaker is sounding a lot different since Mr. Trump got elected, and I like to hear that. But if you're here on a student visa, you're a guest of this country, and guests can be asked to leave, okay? But I think these foreign students who are inciting hatred are just the tip of the iceberg. Cultural Marxism and critical theory burrowed into academia in this country decades ago, and that needs to be rooted out.
Valerie, you want to take a swing at it quickly?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that a green card is not citizenship. And you are here. You have to follow our laws. You can't come in spewing hate and, like Michael said, inciting violence. It's practically an act of terrorism. Like Speaker Johnson said, these are terrorist acts. They're defending terrorist organizations, and there's no space for that on U.S. soil. So if you are going to act that way, then you have to leave. If you're not an American citizen, bye.
Panel, thank you. When we get back on the Lion Week in Review, we pick our favorite stories of the week. Don't miss it as we wrap up today's show on the Lion Week in Review. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. We always like to wrap up each week by turning to the panel and asking them about their favorite stories at readlion.com. Hey, Valerie, we start with you this week.
Yeah, so we covered 83% of U.S. aid programs being cut at this point, and to many on the left, that looks like detriment. That looks like eliminating helping other countries. But when you look at the things that we're eliminating, it is government waste. It is funding transgender studies. It is funding transgender comic books. It is funding gender ideology and leftist agendas that we shouldn't be funding in other countries, when we can take that money and we can foster it here in America, and then we can use it to actually help people in ways that are going to help the less fortunate. And so I think that's really exciting to see. I really want to bring light to it because it is a good thing when you're able to really dive into what's actually happening instead of looking at it on the surface level and saying that we're not trying to help countries anymore.
Josh Mann, your favorite story of the week?
This one's a little different. We've been covering off and on Christian persecution around the world, and we've got a new article about some Syrian Christians and persecution there. We've been seeing this in various places, and I think it's important to remember as Christians that in a lot of places, not only are they battling, free speech is sort of down the road of their battle, they're actually battling for their lives, and so it's important to remember that.
Michael Ryan.
Yeah, this is a story that every parent in America needs to read, and I want you to read it and send it to everyone you know. The headline is, OK, Oklahoma, State Superintendent launches investigation into sexually explicit high school assignment. Listen to this. A handout asks students to choose whether they believe certain activities describe, quote, normal sexual behavior, including having sex with more than one person at a time, becoming aroused by exposing yourself in public, bondage, voyeurism, cross-dressing, sadism, masochism, sex toys, rape fantasies, bestiality, necrophilia, and fetishes involving feces and urine. Parents, are you paying attention?
That will do it for this week's edition of the Lion Week in Review. Can't add anything more to that, but that's the kind of stuff you're going to find at readlion.com. And if you missed any of today's show, or you want to get caught up on the news of the week, be sure to always catch readlion.com. Check out this show anytime you want on YouTube. For all of us at The Lion, thanks for downloading the show, and we'll see you next time.